Welcome everybody to our first Queensland Power BI user group and Power BI and Fabric user group meeting for 2025. And it is actually a milestone event for us tonight, as we have officially been running for 10 years today. Well, February 2015 was when this user group started. So we're looking to organize an in-person party to celebrate. Unfortunately, both Gilbert and I have been so busy we haven't had time to try and organize it. But it would be good if anybody who's in our user group has any good ideas of a location that we could use. Maybe your company has a big area where you can host a social. And if anybody's company would like to sponsor, that would be awesome. But anyway, it is a milestone for us. 10 years is a long time to be running a user group. So, and I know that we've got people on the call today who have been part of our user group for all of those 10 years. So, yeah, it's just a great achievement. So, is there anybody on the call who is attending for the first time tonight? If you are, just maybe use the raise your hand feature. No? Okay. Well, that's great. So everybody else should know by now how we operate. So we'll start off with Gilbert doing a what's new about what's happened in Power BI and Fabric since we last met, and then we'll get straight into our main presentation of the evening. So over to you, Gilbert.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. As usual, I'm going to run through most of the updates since December and February. Just to confirm, you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, so there's as with every month, it seems there's more updates with Copilot and AI, where now they're talking about just summaries in reports and using that to get more information. Then there's a new option, explore this data on visuals. So when you actually on a visual, you can right-click, explore this data, and then you can use the second image where you can basically see, making it a bit easier for some users, with where it uses rows and columns instead of x-axis, y-axis. So just making it easier for people to explore the data from that visual. There's also an update to the storytelling in PowerPoint, where you can now reset the behavior, so allowing you to resync it with Power BI. So, if you've got PowerPoints to open every month, you can resync or restore it to the initial view, which is actually quite handy. There's been enhancements to the text slicer settings, where you can control an on and off toggle and allowing the slicer to accept multiple values or other existing formatting options for the input text. Apply button and input text box from the November update will remain the same in the formatting pane, so just keeping updates on those. There's also been enhancement to the tree map visual. On the top left is a squarified kind of view. On the top right is a binary type of view. If you look, they're sort of different. And then on the bottom is an alternating view where you can see that's different. So just updates to the tree map visuals. There's also semantic model version history. This only applies currently to the web edited premium semantic models, so the models that are created in the Power BI service. But the good news is that they are going to keep on rolling out updates, and this will eventually become available to semantic models in Pro workspaces. So it's just good to see that you will have this version history where you can go backwards and forwards on your models. There's also an option now, just to following on from that, to edit or view your semantic models in the service. So just allowing you to be able to make changes, or if you just want to actually view it and give people those permissions. There's also a nice update with the Tyndall scripting experience, which is now available on Power BI Desktop. So what that means is that the Tyndall is, as you can see on the right-hand side, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but basically it's a much easier format in terms of all the different things you can do in Power BI Desktop, even some of the functionality that isn't directly available. The other thing you can do with Tyndall is you can actually save these files out and just copy and paste them back in and apply it. And for example, here it'll just create the measures for you automatically. So you can do that programmatically. They like to keep us on our toes. So now in Power BI Desktop, it's now been renamed to the One Leg Catalog. Before it was One Leg Explorer or something. It's all the same, but just a semantic change in there. There is now folder support in Git, allowing, when you create those folders, structure in the service, this will also now flow through to your Git support. In the service, there's updates to add Copilot summaries to Power BI email subscriptions. So as you can see on the left is where it's generating it, and on the right is a rough overview of that. Obviously, you need to be running an F64 or higher, or have Copilot in order to use that. There's now, when you explore the One Leg catalog for semantic model, table, and column descriptions, now appear, so you can see if the type is a table or column and what those descriptions are, just helping you to get a bit more information. Then moving on to the Fabric side of stuff, as always, there's a lot going on. So pretty much what I've just highlighted here is all the updates that have happened within the Fabric warehouse. Updates, things like JSON aggregates, preview, SQL Analytics performance improvement. So what that is typically when you write something to a warehouse, it doesn't always appear in the SQL Analytics endpoint immediately. So they're just making improvements to that. And ideally, if any of these things look at something that's interesting to you, this is available on the Fabric monthly update blog. Then there's also the Python notebook preview, so you can just have a pure Python notebook running, which apparently can potentially use a smaller Spark compute, so just allowing you to use Python and potentially reduce how many capacity units you're using. There now is also notebook live versioning. So what this is, it automatically has checkpoints that are created every 5 minutes. You can also do manual checkpoints, basically saving it if you want to make a change there. And on the right, again, it's not great to see, but you can track history of your changes to see, what was happening at certain points in time. You can also do comparisons between the different versions. And then obviously, if you want to roll something back, you can also restore to previous versions. So this is great to see that it's available, because very often I made a change in the past and gone, oh, now how do I roll it back? I've already run it. So it's great to see that you could do a notebook live versioning. I'm not sure if this has been mentioned, but I'll just mention it again. There's now Dataflow Gen 2 CI/CD support for data flows in Fabric. So that was a big ask. And I might have been mentioned before. On the Fabric real-time intelligence, there's a few updates here. Just override lates, arrival tolerance, creation of new items, some new APIs, etc. Then on Fabric mirroring now supports replicating data source schemas. So if you're replicating a database and it's got schemas, it'll replicate that through. Delta column mapping support for mirroring is now available. That relates to the column mappings, making sure the columns, if they have spaces, that should still work. And mirroring now also supports CI/CD in preview. Again, that version control at GitHub is supported. One thing that people have been asking for a long time is ownership takeover for Fabric items. So this is now available for almost all the workloads or the items that you have. I can't remember which one, but there's one that hasn't been rolled out yet, but pretty much all the defaults, lake houses, notebooks, etc. You now can just go and take that over as you would do with a semantic model. Just make sure, like it says there, you need your credentials to be done. And I'll duplicate. They've also introduced Fabric Copilot capability. So what this means is you still got to spin up an F64 SKU, but what you can do is you can assign that F64 for Copilot scenarios only. And what they'll then allow is users in Pro or Premium per user workspaces to use the Copilot capability. So it would be great if that was made on the smaller SKUs, but at least there is some way where you can give Copilot to other users without having to use an existing F64 capacity that might be busy. There's a Power BI report server January update where there's updates in the modeling for dynamic formatting strings. The info.view is available, and performance improvements with calculation group strings in Excel. There's data connectivity and a whole lot of visualizations that have now been included in the January version. And thanks, I forgot to mention this in the beginning, so apologies. Thanks to Adayco for sponsoring our meetup. And that's it.
Thanks, Gilbert. Yeah, some interesting ones there that take over. I know a lot of people were waiting for a very long time for that. So
yeah,
happy to see it. Also, I agree with your comment about Copilot and F64. Given how much cheaper AI has become just in the last year and a half from when ChatGPT first released, I wouldn't be surprised in the future if we see the F64 requirement being reduced.
I did see one thing where the amount of tokens that it uses for the capacity has dropped by half, meaning it uses less capacity. But they should then just also, as you say, hopefully just drop the limit, the bar to be lower also.
Yeah.
Should be cool.
Awesome. Okay, so with that, I will. I'm just trying to find my notes. So, I'm very disorganized today. There we go. Finally. Okay. So thank you to Gilbert for the What's New. So we'll move straight on to our main presentation of the evening. So tonight we've got Antony Catella, who's going to be presenting to us on user-defined formatting in Power BI. Antony does have a slide that introduces himself, but very briefly, Antony is based out of the United Kingdom, and actually has been a fairly regular attendee at our user group whenever we do it online for the last while, and put his hand up to present at this presentation. So thank you very much, Antony. Looking forward to it very much. And over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Craig. Yeah, thanks very much for having me. And, morning from the UK and evening for everybody in down Australia, New Zealand way. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully people can see that.
Yep.
If we can just confirm. Great. Cool. Obviously, if you do have any questions, then just do ask them in the chat as we're going along, and then we can deal with them while we've still got the context of on that current time. Anyway, so the topic tonight is user-defined formatting in Power BI. It's one of the things that I was been thinking about for quite a while. I'll get onto the sort of the main part of it in the introduction. One of the key things to note on the introduction slide is that some people may know, as Craig earlier did, is that this is a chameleon on the intro slide. One of the key things to take a look at is that the coloring of the chameleon on this slide is the sort of green and black coloring on it. And there's a reasoning for pointing out this coloring, so bear that in mind when you get to a couple of the next slides. About myself is I work as a BI consultant for a consultancy here in the UK. We work primarily with the big non-profits, developing Power BI reports and doing training for their staff. I also co-organise the Devon and Cornwall Microsoft Power BI user group. I'm sort of very passionate about the natural world and love my mountain biking and baking in my spare time. My LinkedIn is on here as well, and my GitHub as well. I will be, if you take a note of that, I will be uploading the PBEX to a folder into there later on in the day, my time today, so people can download the PBEX and play around with it and see how to actually build some of the things that we're going to go through. One of the key things to what I have done with this particular PBEX is that, as working with the nonprofits, is that the data set that I'm actually using is an anonymized sort of random set of data that when you're working with the nonprofits, it's looking at how many donors you're getting to those nonprofits and how much income those donors are actually giving you to as a nonprofit. So the data set that I've actually all got here is all got income and number of donors. So it's very different to your sort of AdventureWorks or Contoso and things like that. So it's a very different set of data that a lot of other people may have used. So hopefully it's something slightly different for everybody to think about. So if I get onto the introduction slide here, as I said, why chameleon and a zebra side of things in the context of this particular one. If you need me to sort of enlarge stuff, then please shout. It'll be a lot easier. So the two chameleons on the left-hand side, the one from the first slide deck and the two that are on this page, as you can, may recall, the one on the first page was sort of black and green. The top one here is totally green, and the one just below it is totally brown. Now, all three of them are flat-necked chameleons. They're exactly the same species. They're all found in the Kruger National Park on the sort of eastern side of South Africa. So they're all found in the same region. But chameleons have this amazing ability to, you've got different color schemes for the same species, but they also have this amazing ability to change color depending on the actual, the background that they're actually over. And I've seen this before where chameleons will change from whatever the coloring is. So if they're on sort of green grass, they'll try and blend into that. They'll then move over into sort of gray gravel, and they'll move over, the coloring will actually change to a sort of more sort of a gray color side of things to blend into their surroundings. Whereas zebras don't have that ability. They're black and white, and they're always going to be black and white, the zebra species found in South Africa. And all your zebra species are actually black and white. They might have a slight variation in their pattern, but the species itself has got exactly the same pattern. It doesn't have the ability to change its coloring. Now, how does that come into Power BI? Well, if we think about it, pretty much every report we build is we define the colors of the columns. We define the format of the labels, the data labels. So have they got 2 decimal places? Do we show or hide labels on columns? All those sort of things are a lot more fixed when it comes to us developing reports. Whereas what I'm thinking about is, one, we give users the ability to change the formatting of the visual on the fly. Now, people will say, well, why do you want to do that? Well, the thing is for us is that, as I said, we work with a lot of nonprofits. We do this one pretty large benchmarking project across a range of nonprofits. And you're looking at dealing with, each year we're working with about 100 different clients. They're all accessing exactly the same report that we publish into we've got our own Power BI tenancy, shared capacity tenancy, and that's really important for later on. And we have literally at the last count I checked yesterday, we've got 1,300 guest users all coming into our tenancy, all using exactly the same Power BI report. Now, obviously, they're coming from different parts of the world. And you've got lots of people who may want to see something in a slightly different way, not necessarily change the style of the visuals, but some people like to remove the data labels. Some people want to have them on. You may have certain metrics that some people would rather change that metric to just be a whole number. They might want to actually put 1 decimal place. They might want to put 2 decimal places into metrics. So it gives people the ability to be able to change things around. So that's the idea behind this. So what we're trying to do is ultimately we're trying to get to the scenario at the end here where on the top left, this is just sort of some of the examples of what you might want to do in a report. So for example, in here is that I've got a column chart and I'm just wanting to highlight the highest and lowest columns within that chart. You might want to have the ability just to highlight the highest column. What about if I wanted to just highlight the values that were above an average of that particular data set? What happens if you say, for example, I don't want to actually show the average line? You might want to take that off and revert back to just showing the highest and lowest. You might want to change the actual values to actually be showing the whole numbers. You might want to actually show them in billions, for argument's sake. just depending on what you're trying to do, because there are a lot of situations, especially with the auto formatting of within Power BI, you can get some very weird things happening. Or I found that the numbers that come up, you may have, so for example, if you think about some of the currencies of the world, is where you might have certain currencies, say for example South Korea, they have a lot of numbers just because the Korean won is the way it is, whereas in US dollars you don't have as many digits in numbers. So you want to have the ability to be able to switch around in your visuals. Or that's my feeling. Or what about if you're wanting to actually show, instead of just showing the income at the top of the columns, what if you wanted to have the ability to show the income percentage change above your columns? Or you might want to have the ability to show what's the income as well as your percentage change, and then just change your columns. So you've got all your columns visible and all your different labels up at the top of your columns. Or you might want to actually have something completely different. So you might want to actually look at, so the baseline of all the actual columns is showing total income, but your label is actually showing average income per donor, which again, you might want to change it to do 2 decimal places if you want. You might want to not worried about that and just change it to whole numbers. So it gives people that flexibility depending on what they're actually wanting to do. So we'll go through all the different steps to get to the final end results of this. But what I wanted to start off with, first of all, is talking about dynamic format strings to start with. So you've had dynamic format strings in calculation groups since calculation groups came about. So the idea behind it is it applies a format string to a measure that you've got within your visuals, and actually, in fact, on your whole page. So it's very useful if you're trying to do a mass apply a large change across the entire page or all the visuals in that page, and that can also be to your detriment as well, because what I generally do as a developer is that I have a lot of dynamic titles in my visuals. So I will often change the titles depending on what the selections that people have made. Particularly when I'm using field parameters, I will generally get my titles to be dynamic, so they'll show whatever those the items that they are displaying on the chart. I often might have subtitles that are dynamic as well. The challenge with calculation groups is that the calculation group will try and will do the calculation across all the measures on those visuals or potentially pages. So you're going to get dynamic titles which are text, and your visuals are going to break. You can get around that with a few going through hoops and things like that within calculation groups to try and exclude certain measures for that to be applied, but it can involve a lot more sort of legwork to actually do that. All the other thing that we've now got is to get a little bit more granular control, where you can do dynamic format strings for measures. They came about in April 2023 when they first came out. They were made generally available in October last year. Now, within dynamic format strings for measures, you can either use the measure name itself, or you can indirectly use selected measure within the dynamic format string as well. Now, what I'm going to do is on this first page here is just to go through as to, for people who don't know how to use dynamic format strings, how you actually use them. So what I'm actually going to do is start off by looking at the first, some of the measures that I've actually got in this visual itself. So the first measure to think about is that we've actually got this measure. I'll zoom in a bit. So this is our baseline measure that I've created. So all the income in the Power BI, in the fact table, is all being converted into USD. And this is the baseline measure that is essentially used to feed everything else, income-related measures within the report. So this particular measure itself is that I've got this particular measure formatted as it was as currency. It's obviously switched over to dynamic for some reason. But if I change it back over to currency, which is the the sort of standard format that it would have. So currency-wise, it's set to auto. And it's set to currency. So what that'll look like is in the table down below here, is that the currency for this particular total income USD has got the dollar sign in the front of it. It's got 2 decimal places in front of it. Some of them have gone further out because it's been set to auto. If I just change the format of this, and I'll change it to 2 decimal places, so at least it's the same for all the way through the demo, so people can actually see that the baseline measure, this is what the baseline measure does, is that it's got 2 decimal places and it's set to currency. If we wanted to change this to dynamic, is if you click on the drop down box up at the top here, there's an option here for dynamic. Now what will happen is that when you change it to dynamic, on the left hand side of your measure, you'll get another option coming about here, which is called format. So in the drop-down box here, you'll have for the measure, so that's your DAX measure that you're using, and you'll get your format. Now, if we look at the format up top here in the actual bar, in the formula bar, you've actually got, this is the default formula, the format string that gets created when you change from currency to dynamic. So what happens is with this particular format string is that it's got a slash before the dollar sign. It's going to put negative numbers in brackets, and you've got a third option at the end here. We'll get into the semantics of format strings in the next page. But one of the things to remember is that when you change it, so if I go and look at the actual measure that I've got down here, this fixed measure, is that what I'm doing here is where I've got income change by year. Now, what I've done here is that I've got the DAX measure itself built in there, and I've set that to currency. And as I said, is that when you've got something set to currency, it'll show up the negative numbers with a bracket. Now, I generally don't tend to like having the brackets. I like to put a minus sign for negative numbers. So what I've done here for the same measure, I'm using the exact, I'm actually referring to that fixed measure itself. But what I've gone and done, I've changed the format string for this dynamic one, and I'm using that format string that we generated just now for the when we changed over from currency to dynamic. So that's how very easy it is to actually change over to using format strings. So let's get on to how do these format strings, how are they structured? So this is a bit of base information for people to on custom numeric format strings. So what happens is a numeric format string can have 3 sections to it. If you don't have to have all 3, you don't have to use all 3. If you use one section only, that expression will apply to all the values. So whether it's positive, negative, or 0. If you use 2 sections of that format string, the first section will apply to positive and the zeros, and the second one to the negatives. If you use all 3 sections, the first is positive, second is negative, and the third is 0. This can be very, very useful, which you'll see later on, where you might want to use icons to designate an up value or a down value within your format strings, which you can obviously do if you're using all 3 sections, because you might want to indicate an up arrow for the positive values, a down arrow for the negative, but you don't want to use any sort of icon for values that are 0. Now, so if we get into the characters that you can use in format strings. Now, one of the things that you might come across is that if you do the DP600, you may actually come across a question or 2 on format strings within the DP600, as I discovered the other day. And so what happens is that a 0 placeholder is a mandatory placeholder. So what happens there is that it'll display a digit, whether there's a number or not. So if you have a number that is, say, for example, 1.2, and you had 00.0, it'll put a 0 before that 1. A hash is an optional placeholder. A dot is the decimal placeholder, so it'll determine how many digits are displayed to the left and right of it. Percentage sign changes a number to a percentage. A comma, which is your thousand separator, will separate your thousands from your hundreds. So if you have a thousand separator, so for example, in this particular example here is where it'll put a comma in for the thousand separator. So if you've got a whole number of just 1, 2, 3, 4, it'll put a comma in at the 1,000 within that space. But you can also use it to divide numbers. So for example, every comma on the left-hand side of the decimal point will divide that number by 1,000. So if you have 1 comma, it'll be then in thousands. If you do 2 commas, you'll end up in millions. 3 commas, it'll change to billions. And this can be very, very useful if you're wanting to use this to do some complex format strings, as we'll see later on. And you can also, the other thing as well that you can also do is you can also add different text strings as well. And one of the things that I always say is make sure that you put apostrophe or double quotes around your text string if you're using text strings within your format strings, because particularly if you've got text strings after the actual decimal separator, you can get some very weird results coming out, particularly if you're doing currency formatting, which we'll get onto a bit later on. You can get some very weird results. So I'd always recommend putting the text string in double quote in quotes, so you don't get some weird results later on. So that's the basics of format strings. Now, what we're going to do is go on to sort of, well, how do we use these format strings? There's a multitude of different ways as to how you can apply these different format strings. So what I'm going to do is that I've just sort of named these different ways of doing it. So I've called this table-based format strings. And the reason why I've called it table-based is that this particular slicer is I've created a whole lot of different tables, data tables here. They're all just calculated tables. And what I've done is that I've gone and created a whole lot of different format strings. So this particular one has got these different format strings that I'm going to apply to the values depending on what you've selected as a user in the slicer. That format string will be applied to that measure. So for example, so that's for this one on the top left. If I drop down to the one on the left hand side, on the bottom left, this one here, I've created a whole lot of other even more sort of different options. So I've got a format string to format absolute numbers. I've got a format string for doing currencies. I've got one for doing percentages. And I've also included one for doing percentages, but also includes different icons within those percentages. So it's a case of I can just reference all these different tables using slices, and depending on what you're actually wanting to apply to your particular measures. So if we look at the on the top right here, the whole numbers here is that if we look at the actual visuals themselves, is that the chart here, it changes everything to whole numbers, same within the table here as well. If I change it to whole with 2 decimal places, it changes and you get your 2 decimal places. Thousands, millions, or even going to your billions will change things around. Now, one key thing to remember if you are using dynamic format string is, this is the thing that has caught me out multiple times, is particularly on your column charts side of things and line charts, is to go to the y-axis and actually go to your values and make sure your display units are set to none. If you leave that set to auto, you could get some very, very weird things happening. So for example, here, if I set this to auto, you can see here you end up with 0 BNN, because it's obviously the auto side is trying to convert everything to billions because of the values that you've got. But then on top of that, the format string is now converting that again using the billions that you've decided on in your format string. So you end up with some very weird results coming out. So that's the key thing, is to change it over to none, and it'll generally go back to what it was. I have pointed this out to a couple of people at Microsoft, and they know that that is an issue, and that the auto can do some very weird actions with the numbers if you're using the format string. So that's one thing to be very cautious of. Then on the bottom one, same sort of principle, is that I'm using that to change the number of decimal places within the measures themselves. What we're actually going to do quickly is just look and see, well, okay, so what does the measure actually look like here? So if I click on this, the table-based one here, the measure is referencing that original base measure that we used. But if I go to the actual format itself, it's looking for the selected value from that table that is the slicer is based on. So whatever that format string is that we're referencing, it'll apply that to the actual measure itself. And so if we do a very similar situation, is that if we now go and look at the actual measure for income per year side of things, which has also been based on the different tables that we've got, and we look at the format string on this one, it's exactly the same. But in this situation, as I showed people earlier, is that there were a whole lot of different columns that I had in there. So in this situation here, is that for this particular measure, I'm using the same slicer to determine things, but for this particular measure, because it's a currency value associated with it, I'm going to use the formatting for currencies for this particular measure itself. So that's how to sort of looking at from a sort of what I just call a table-based approach side of things. You can also do things in a measure-based approach. Now, what do you mean by a measure-based approach? So if I look at this, is that I've got a slicer here, which will decide whether it's fixed or variable. If I go into the measures themselves, and what I mean by measure-based approach is that within the actual format string itself, you can actually create some quite complex DAX within that format string. You don't have to create just basic sort of 3 sections to your format string. You can actually go and create some pretty interesting DAX within the format string. So within this particular scenario here, is that what I wanted to do here was change the format of the numbers. So if you selected fixed, is that the formatted value would be the same format across the entire matrix. If you set it to variable, is that that format string will change for each of the values. So for example, if I look at this table on the top table at the top here, just remove the filter on the left-hand side here. So I've set fixed. So what the fixed will do is that it'll format all the numbers based on whatever the maximum is that's visible in the context of that visual. So for example, here it's all in billions, the maximum value. So all the numbers are going to be shown in billions. Whereas if I filter it down to Africa, because there's everything is maximum of millions, it changes the formatting. So everything gets shown as millions. If I change this to variable, what will happen is that you'll get variable formats coming through. So depends on the row context here. So your row here for the Congo is in thousands, so it shows it with a K. If you look at South Africa here, it's in millions, so it formats as millions. So that's the idea of having the sort of fixed variable depending on what you're actually wanting to do. You might find that this is actually too confusing for users, so you might not want to implement something like this, but it's just another variation of what you can actually do. The other option is that if we look at the bottom visual, the bottom chart here, and I go and look at the what I call the measure-based approach as well. Again, in the format string here, I've created a whole lot of different options here. So like I said, you can make it quite complex depending on what you're wanting to do. So in this scenario here is, as I said earlier, is you can reference the measure name itself, or you can reference selected measure within the actual format string. So for example, here is that the selected measure, I'm actually this is just referencing the measure itself that I'm using, and it's converting it to the different numbers. I'm then wanting to use different options for the percentage side. If I then wanting to change the percentage change, I've then got an option within here. And then depending on what the selected value is, so I'm doing a selected value referencing a table as well. So in some ways, I'm collecting a table. I'm combining the option of having a table to for the slicer, but then I'm actually doing all the sort of the combinations that you want in terms of formatting that within the actual dynamic format string of that particular measure itself. So that's sort of looking at the sort of measure-based approach. Any questions from anybody, Craig?
No, we haven't had any. A lot of people excited by what you just showed, but no questions at this stage.
No worries. So let's go look at another option here. Is if we now look at what I've just termed a reference measure. So what do I mean by a reference measure? So if I go and select some of these measures that we're looking at here. So in this table here is that I'm still using a slicer on the left-hand side. This particular slicer is just looking at a slightly different variation on some of the other options, where this particular one is, say, for example, in other options I've shown is where you want to change between whole numbers and billions and millions, but you also want to change decimals. You might want to have just one sort of set of values that people can select. So they can only select like whole with no decimals, whole with 2 decimals, and thousands with 0 decimals, etc. So I'm still referencing this table within the slicer. But if I look at some of these measures themselves, so if I look at the first one here for the selected value option, again, I'm still referencing my original base measure that had currency format applied to it. But if I now look at the actual format for it, is that it's cross-referencing that original, the table that we did earlier. So it's referencing the selected value. And one of the things that I would also strongly recommend if you are doing things is have an alternative option within here, because you may want to use this measure somewhere else and somebody may not want to use a slicer in a visual. So is to have an alternative format string that will always apply. Doesn't matter where you use that measure itself. But there's also the other option where you might want to actually, instead of referencing the actual table itself, you may have this scenario here where, and I've done this in production in reports that we've got, where I'm actually referencing another measure. So in this scenario here is that the display unit side of things. So this is actually referencing another measure that I'm using here. So this display unit decimal format that's referencing the table to pick up the format string, and then that format string has been applied to that measure that we've actually got. Now, the reason for doing this is that I've used this in production on one of these main reports that I was talking about, where we've got 2 or 3 base measures, one which will do sort of absolute, one that does absolute with 1 decimal place, another one that does absolute with 2 decimal places, and a fourth one that does currency, I think it is. And then we've only got 4 places to go and change that. If we need to go do changes to those particular format strings, I've only got to change that in 4 places. And then those 4 measures are referenced in the dynamic format strings across pretty much all the measures. And our model, that's got about 300 odd measures in that data model. So it's a lot easier to go and change that format string in one place if I need to. Or if you're at least referencing another table, you've got one place to change that format string if you need to. So this is why you can also reference another measure from that where you can calculate all your logic, put your logic in, and then reference it within your format string. So that's covering off all the different format strings. If there's any question, if there's no questions, I'm going to jump on to the actual conditional formatting side of things. So in the conditional formatting options here is that what I've got here is that I've got a slicer on the top left-hand side here, and this again is just referencing another table with all the different values that I'm wanting to use. And within this particular option here is depending on what I'm wanting to do within these particular visuals on the page. So for example, the first option, I might want to remove the labels from those visuals. Yes, there are those situations where you might think, well, if I load to the auto option on here, I want to have the x-axis, I can see where I am. But then if you remove the labels and you didn't have the x-axis, yes, that might be a challenge. I generally find with a lot of the visuals that I've done for this particular project is I've left the x-axis on and I've had the option to toggle the labels on and off, because to be honest is that a lot of the time you've got this different user base that you've got to deal with. And I'd rather give people different options depending on how they're actually wanting to look at things. But also, too, you might end up with a visual that has got a lot of values on it, and it helps to be able to turn off those labels. So, for example, on the chart on the right-hand side, it's not too bad, but you might want to have the option where you want to turn off the labels on a visual itself. If I want to say, for example, the highest and lowest, so changing the color of the columns, and changing the color of the labels themselves. I might want to just change the highest themselves. Now, if we go look at some of the actual measures that are driving all of these different options here, is that I've got a number of measures that I use. First of all, what I tend to do in a lot of my reports is that I have a couple of base measures that I use for all my colors. And they can be very, very useful because you've then got one place that you can change all your different hex codes that you're using. So you might have particular brand colors that you've got to use. So for example, I'm using blue here just as a general color. I'm using green to indicate positive. I've got gray for another alternative option. I've got red, for example. I've also got a transparent color as well. So you can use these as your base fonts, your base colors, to then reference those anywhere else within your report. So for example, if I look at the color formatting, for example, for the countries, so people might look at this and go, oh my goodness gracious, it is a long piece of DAX. I know it is. But this gives all the different variations as to, depending on what was selected, what colors would actually, how your colors would be applied to your columns. And then I've also got different options for the labels as well. So I've got very similar logic being applied to the labels, but I've got slightly different, I wanted certain slightly different options for my labels to show or not show, depending on what the colors were. So so they are quite complex, they're quite lengthy pieces of DAX, but people can use that. They can chop it down, use whatever bits they're wanting to actually use within these measures. And then the other thing as well is that you can also combine this with a...
Sorry, Anthony.
Yeah.
Sorry, you said I should interrupt you as soon as there's questions.
Yeah, of course.
So there is one from Falmi. Is it possible to use line break within a format string? I don't know if you can see the question.
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah, within a format string. I haven't I can't answer that question. I'd have to go away and have a look. What you could do for me is what I've done is depending on where you want to put that particular option. So what I've done, so for example, is in the format strings, I might as well just quickly jump onto it, is the final one here. So on the display labels here is that what I ended up doing here is that I ended up using I'm using different options for the labels here. So for example, the top one where the actual income is, I'm using I think it's the name format side of things. So if I just double check here, so on the data labels, I'm using the value option for the top for the income. And then for the bottom one for the income change, I'm using the detail. So you could also use the title as well. And I had considered using the title so I could have 3 different options. And so that's another option that you could play with, is if you're wanting to split those out onto different lines. That's how I managed to achieve this, was to do things on different lines, is by making use of the value and the detail. So depending on what options I'm wanting to show, I can then use that. So for example, the income percentage change is always going to be shown using the detail label. If I'm combining the two, then the income I'll end up using both options. So that's another option that you could think of doing as well. But yeah, that's something I want to look at, is to try and see if I could get line breaks into it. Then the other thing in terms of the conditional formatting is that you can also make use of, tie that in with a what if parameter as well. So for example, this bottom what if parameter here, if I look at the top here, I've got top n, bottom n, top n percent, and bottom n percent. And the slicer on the bottom here controls all of those options. So for example, if I'm wanting to show the sort of top 5 options here as I selected, this will then highlight the top 5 in the particular charts that I'm working with. If I selected the bottom n, it'll show me the bottom 5 options within the charts. If I'm wanting to look at the top n percent, it'll show me the top 5% of those charts, or in this case, the bottom 5% of those charts. And depending on what you're doing, it'll then change that around. The other thing as well that you might want to look at doing is using colors to change the colors of your visuals. Now, one of the key requirements, and why I point this out, is that one of the key requirements that we have in our production report is that we're dealing with 20 to 30 different organizations, and potentially some visuals have got up to 18 organizations in one visual, and each organization, we have to apply their brand colors to their column or their line. So it can be very, I would say from a purely design philosophy, I don't really like it, but that's been the requirement from the client, unfortunately. So for example, you might want to have an option where, in this example here, is that I've got a hex code. And in this example for the countries is that I'm just actually using the formatting for the countries. I'm actually using the hex code that actually exists in the so I've actually got a hex code in the country table, and it just picks up the hex code from that table. In this example here on the right-hand side for the actual column charts is that you could actually have another option where you could actually change the color depending on what you're actually doing within the column chart itself. So you might want to give people the options to change the color that they're actually being displayed in the column column chart itself. You could do the same with another chart. It's just giving people a different color that they might want to select in a particular chart itself. Now, people might say, well, how do you get the different gradations on the colors here? Is that if we look at the measure itself for these the years themselves, I think it's in this one here on the font colors. Or it's in not that one. It's always trying to find the correct one. There we go. So So how this works, side of things, is that if you add two numbers at the back end of a hex code, that'll change the percentage and change the opacity of the color that's being displayed. So, for example, in this situation here is that 2023 is going to be the full 100% of the hex code. 2022 will be 90% opacity of the actual the color selected. The 2021 will be 80% of it, all the way back to 20% opacity of the color that you actually selected. So I have looked at other variations on this, so to try and look at the option of changing those opacity depending on the actual selected values. Yeah, Ashok, that is something that I have looked at. I have seen some sort of options where people have changed the background theme, but is something that I'm wanting to investigate as well, is to actually using a different color schemes, particularly for accessibility side of things, is so people could select a particular color palette and then that'll be applied to the actual theme itself. That's something that I sort of my next going down the rabbit hole that I'm wanting to actually look at. So so that's what we've got in terms of the color formatting. So it gives you a whole lot of different options for the color formatting of the different charts on a page, depending on what you're wanting to do. Right, so if we've now got that, we can now combine all of those different functionalities together, and you can now have options where I can show the highest and lowest changes the colors within the charts itself, or I can actually combine it together with these slices on the left-hand side. What's the DAX code behind hex code is, if I show this one again, for me is, so that's the DAX code behind that one. And then the font color for the selected hex code is, where are you now? No, just find it here. So on this particular one, so on the font color on the selected hex code is just picking up the hex code from the color column table that I've got. So what I've actually done in this particular instance is that I've actually got a table done in, where are they? Here we go, the dim colors. So I've created a table here with all the colors. Those are the different colors, and those are the different hex codes that you've got applying into it. And then adding 00, yes, it will make it transparent. So depending on what you're actually wanting to do, that's what will happen. Is that all right for me now? And so so you've got the different DAX within here side of things. So so this is now getting towards our one of our main charts. So in this particular one, as I said, you might want to have a cut down version of all the different permutations. So for example, this one is a little bit not as complex, where you've only got limited selections on the left-hand side for your color formatting, and you've got a limited set of format strings that you want to allow people to actually use. Again, make sure you change your y-axis to none, because you will get some very weird results coming out on your columns and your y-axis and your labels used on the top of the columns. And then we finally get to the last one, which is the one that we showed earlier, where we've got all the different options where people can flip and choose between whatever they're wanting within your report. Now, one of the key things that I will say to people is just because we can doesn't necessarily mean we should. One of the things to bear in mind is be very careful of performance issues when you're using dynamic format strings, because a measure that has a dynamic format string will generate two queries side of things. So it doesn't generate just one query within the engine, it'll actually generate two queries. I've actually got a link to a SQL BI. I think it was Marco Alberto did a detailed video on dynamic format strings. So that's one thing to be careful of. The other thing as well is to do some testing within your actual report itself from a performance perspective. Do a double check to see, is it going to impact anything on the performance wise? Now, from my experience is that the report that we've built, we've got options for people to change the decimal places. We've got options for them to show and hide labels. The fact tables that we're working with, we've got one fact table that's 77 million rows of data. We've got another one that's in the same semantic model, has got 45 million rows of data. We've got a third fact table that's got 30 million rows of data in it. And I've not found any performance degradation. I've done loads of tests locally, and I've also done tests in the service, and I haven't found any performance degradation within the reports. So that's just one thing to, just to make sure about. And particularly if you've got quite complex stacks as well behind some of these, is just to be aware of that. Now, I wanted to go on to another option, is looking at currency conversion. Now, one of the things that we have to do in our reports is that we also have to convert everything to different currencies, because we're working across different countries of the world. Is that we've had to give users the ability to show income in local currency, USD, and euros. That's just been the requirement that we've needed to do. But what you can also do is that you might want to actually have a much more dynamic report, where you may not just have local currency. You might have it in various, or USD and euros. You might want to have a whole lot of other different currencies that people can choose from. In this current PBEX itself, is that I've got a list of all the currencies here that are used in the report. So if I go to the currency table, and I've got all of these different currencies that I've got the actual currency format that's going to be applied to those currencies itself. Now, you may see it, you may not see it, is for the Danish kroner, is that I've made sure that I've put double quotes around KR dot, because as soon as within a format string, it sees a dot, it thinks it's a decimal place. And so what will happen is, if your numbers are going to be very, very weird, are going to come out very, very wacko if you don't include the double quotes around the actual KR text string. Whereas with Sweden, they don't have a dot at the end of the KR. And so you can actually get away with just having KR without the double quotes side of things. How do you maintain concurrency of the currency table? Actually, in terms of the currency table, is in terms of the actual format strings themselves, or all the different currencies that you've got side of things. If it's the currency formats, they generally will stay the same for particular currencies. The value conversion, I'll get onto that one now, is on the value conversion, is that I've got an exchange rate table. And so there are actually websites out there, one that I use quite a lot. I can't remember the exact name of it. But because of our project that we work on, is that we always use the exchange rate as of the end of a calendar year for doing the currency conversions, which we then pull into the Power BI reports. Yeah, XE is one. There's another one that is also very good that I use for looking up historical exchange rates as well. There are exchange rate tables that you can use, that you can actually hook into via APIs to actually update your system, which is very, very useful, especially when you're doing all these conversions side of things across all the different currencies that you've got in your particular report. So if I go back to the page itself, is so on this particular side of things, is that I've actually given users the ability. So remembering here is that the value that I've actually got using in this chart here, the converted income, again, I'm using a converted income measure, and that again is still using that original total income USD measure to do the conversions. So the format string of that original income USD, which was currency, as you saw earlier, in USD currency, will get overridden by the currency format that we're going to be applying to that particular measure. So that's one of the things to bear in mind, that it'll keep you'll get a hierarchical setup happening. So your format string will keep getting overridden. And so in this situation here is that depending on the currency you've selected, we'll then go and do the actual calculations that you need based on the exchange rate and the particular currency you've selected. So in here is that I've given people the option where they can select Danish kroner. They can go and select Canadian dollars. They can select whatever currency they're wanting in this particular visual itself, and it'll format that particular currency in that the way that it's formatted. Now, one of the things is that why I wanted to do it this way was to give people that flexibility. Because what happens is that a number of the non-profit organizations, they may report at head office, they may report their financial returns in USD, but in other particular offices, they may report their finances in euros or in other currency that they might have. So this gives them the ability to switch and change around, depending on what they're wanting to do. That's in terms of currency, sort of formatting of currencies. Now, and the other good thing about this as well is that instead of just having a number on it, for example, a KPI card, you can at least make sure that you include the currency, what currency is actually being displayed on those KPI cards, for example. The other option that I wanted to look at is looking at locales. Now, you can format things using locales, and a locale is a different locale determines your sort of region of where you're actually coming from. Now, if you look at your settings, Windows settings, there'll be a locale for where you are within the world. And generally is that this will be determined by this setup where it'll be the language and the country. So this is what a locale setting is. So for example, here is where I've got the top one here is where I've got this in Danish in Denmark, but I've also got other options here. So for example, I've got an English Canadian. So if you're in Canada and you want to display things in an English layout, you've got ENCA. There may be another option where you've got the French in Canada who want to display things based on a French layout, but they're still based in Canada. So for example, for the French Canadian one is where they don't actually use commas as the 1000 separator, they use spaces. Same with their sort of number of donors. They don't generally use a comma for the 1000 separator, but what they do is that if I zoom in here a little bit, is that they actually use a comma for where the decimal places side of things. And so people may want to view things in their particular locale. One of the things to be careful of locales, though, be very, very careful of using locales, is that if I go and show you the DAX that's being used here, is if we look at the format string for the locales itself, is that the way that you can get a locale to be formatted is that you have to use the format string. Now, the problem with the format function within DAX is that when you use that, it converts everything to a string. And so if you didn't have these double quotes around this DAX measure, the DAX here, is that this would come out as a string, and so you wouldn't be able to use any bars on matrices. You wouldn't be able to display those numbers on a column chart and things like that. Whereas by putting the double quotes around here, is that what they call a string literal. So in some ways, you're almost fooling Power BI that this is actually a number, even though it's a string side of things. And you can only use locale within the format function. That's the only way that I found to do it. So you have very, very limited options in terms of how you want to change things. So, and the other thing as well to bear in mind when you're using the locale is that on your actual y-axis, you might notice on here is that your y-axis has got exactly the same number replicated on the y-axis here, even though you change the values here to none here, is that even though it's set to none, you get this happening because of the locale side of things. And you end up with that. So just be very, very careful when you are using the locale to try and format numbers. Your charts may do some very weird things. So that's the locale side of things. Again, so if we look on considerations, as I said, one of the things to be careful of is if you're building all of these different measures, you obviously could end up with a whole lot of bloat happening with in your semantic models. Be very careful of that. Be very careful, so consider which ones you really want to use in your use cases, and other ones you may not need them. And as I said at the bottom, doesn't necessarily mean we can, doesn't necessarily mean we should add all these flexibility to reports themselves. And also, I said, be careful of performance. Do some performance tests before you actually implement these across large or semantic models with large amounts of data. And then I've put in a couple of links here for format strings and the YouTube video for SQL BI, so you can have a look at that and to go and check through the different, looking at using dynamic format strings and why you end up with these them generating two queries in the engine. And then my links are there for anybody who's missed those. There we go. Any questions?
Any questions for Antony? Please feel free to come off mute if you do have. Gonna take that as a no, Antony.
No.
But I must be honest, that was an amazing presentation. Truly, the amount of innovation there is just amazing. And I saw at least 5 to 10 things that I didn't know was possible with Power BI tonight, which after 10 years of running this user group is fairly rare for me. So truly, thank you very much.
Wow.
While we had a fairly small audience tonight, I think those that have attended have had great. We'll get great benefit from this, and we will be uploading this to our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. So there were several people during the evening who were asking that if the PBIX was going to be shared. I know you said that at the start that you would share it. So if you could send that through to either Gilbert or myself so we can upload it to our meetup group, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
Just want to thank you again. Are there has anyone come up with any questions they want to ask before we close down for the evening? See Ray's typing. All right. Well, anyway, thank you very much again, Antony. Really appreciate that. Excellent presentation. And everyone we'll see you in about a month's time for the March edition of our user group. And I hope you all have a safe February, and we'll see you then in March. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Have a good day. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.